What we're going to do today is we're going to graph logs. So in order to graph logs, what we're going to do is we're going to write it in exponential form. So first thing that we're going to do is we're going to see our log equation. We're going to turn it into an exponential equation looking at our base number. So our base is 2. So notice that we have a 2 right there. When we change it, notice that y is our exponent and x is the value by itself. How that changes the graph is now that y is our independent variable. We pick the values for y, -1, 0, 1. We have a vertical asymptote instead of a horizontal one. And then what we do is we plug in our values. If we plug in a -1, it flips. Anything to the 0 is 1. And when we plug in a 1, it stays as 2. And then what we're going to do is graph our equation. So if we're looking at our first example, we're going to write it in an exponential form. Notice that our base number is 3. So what we have is 3. Our exponent is the y, and it's equal to x. What we're going to have is we're going to have a vertical asymptote at 0. And we're going to come up with our table of values. And with our table of values, our y value is our independent variable. So we're plugging in -1, 0, and 1. When we plug in a -1, it flips. We get 1/3. When we plug in a 0, anything to the 0 is 1. When we plug in a 1, what we do is we get a 3. So now what we're going to do is we're going to graph this. We have a vertical asymptote at 0. We're going to plot the 1/3 and -1, the 1 and the 0, and the 3 and the 1. And that right there is our graph. Now, if we're looking at our other equation, what we notice is that our base is 4 this time, but we also have a constant value. We need to get the log by itself, so we're going to add the 2. Since our base number is 4, that's going to be our base for our exponential equation. And then we have the y plus 2. Our vertical asymptote is going to be the same. X is equal to 0. And our chart is going to be a little bit different. If you remember from exponentials, we want our exponents to be 0. And that's our middle number. So what we have is -2, -3, and -1. I'm going to plug in the -3. When I plug in the -3, that becomes a -1, so I flip it and I get 1/4. When I plug in a -2, that becomes 0. Anything to the 0 is 1. When I plug in a -1, it becomes a 1, so it's 4. I have my vertical asymptote at 0. I have the 1/4 and the -3. I have the 1 and the -2. I have the 4 and the -1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to graph my equation. Now, looking at letter C, it's different than letter B. Notice that letter B does not have any parentheses, but letter C does. And that's a big difference because the log is by itself. We're not going to subtract the 1 first because it's in parentheses. So that means that when we have a base number, it now becomes x plus 1 equals 2 to the f of x. So in order to get the x by itself, I have to subtract the 1. And that means that this right here is a new asymptote. What we have is x is equal to -1. We're going to come up with our table of values, just like what we've been doing. We're going to have -1, 0, and 1, because my exponent is just f of x. And I'm going to plug in the -1. When I plug in a -1, it flips, so it becomes a half. A half minus 1 is -1/2. Anything to the 0 is 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. Then I plug in a 1. That stays 2. 2 minus 1 is 1. I have my vertical asymptote at -1. I plot my points -1/2, -1, 0, 0, and 1, 1.